Hello and welcome back. This is the Business Industry Panel. My name is Amy LeMay, and I'm a senior member of the CSPC team. It is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this session. Karima S. Sabar is the CEO and partner at Quark Venture LP. She leads their Global Health Sciences Fund, which invests globally in companies with disruptive and converging health technologies and platforms. She is also the chair of the Health Biosciences Economic Strategies Table and the co-founder and chair of GDCC China, a health technology company accelerator. Prior to joining Quark Venture, Karima was the president and CEO of the Centre for Drug Research and Development, Canada's Drug Development and Commercialization Centre. She was the founding chair of the Global Alliance of Leading Drug Discovery and Development Centers and the president and CEO of Life Sciences BC. Today, Karima is serving as both moderator and chair for the Business Industry Panel.
Thank you, Amy. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, and welcome to my esteemed panelists, fellow panelists. I want to first introduce them before I say anything else. We have with us today Angela Mondu, President and CEO of TechNation, Namir Anani, President and CEO of the Information and Communication Technology Council, Tabitha Bull, President and CEO of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, and we have Dr. Karen Churchill, President and CEO of AgWest Bio Inc. And finally, but not least, Carl Blackburn, President and CEO of Quebec Employers Council. Thank you all very much for joining me today on this very important panel. I know it's going to be interesting. So before we get started, I want to just make a few housekeeping comments. I want to remind the audience that they can only interact through the Q&A feature, and I encourage you to please use it. I also encourage you to upvote the relevant questions that you want to see answered so that we can do that in order of priority. And finally, the chat line will be used mostly to communicate with the organizers. So with that, I will get started. Firstly, I want to say that I violently agreed with everything that David Waters talked about this morning. I thought that he and his colleague did a fantastic job in summarizing what is a difficult and heavy budget for us, and in analyzing and commenting beautifully on the important issues. So I want to thank them both to start with. Budget 2021 definitely did not address the long term. And I'm not sure if our expectations were too high in thinking that it should have done under the circumstances of which we are today, with pandemic of the COVID-19 as a major overhang, not yet resolved, lots of unknowns around it, as David spoke about. You know, I wanted to put that caveat in there, but to be clear, we didn't really look at the long term. It really was about recovery, and we can argue that maybe that's what it should be about. But the problem is that we've had many budgets, as David spoke about historically, that have not addressed the long term, have not addressed how we are to unleash the true potential of Canadian innovation and technology to benefit us and the economy. So I think that was a disappointment in some areas, for sure. They've asked whether it was a big budget. Yes, it was a huge budget, but I would also argue, was it big enough? If we wanted and we were going to look at the future, and truly, when we look at the numbers that they presented, of the 22 billion gap that we are lagging behind other OECD countries in the research and innovation arena. When, if not now, if this pandemic doesn't give us a big kickstart and light the fire, then when will it happen? So one can ask that question too. And so I would say that, these were some of my concerns. The other thing that came up, which Waters brought up, and I appreciated his confidence in the economic strategy tables and the industry strategy council work. I thought I should explain it because I think some of the following panels there was not clarity about why we had the two. The economic strategy tables were established following the Prime Minister's Growth Council, which Dominic Barton was chairing and leading, where out of that Growth Council, there came out very strongly that Canada had these high potential sectors that would benefit from support and acceleration, because there was an opportunity to leapfrog the economy. Because if we just continue to bumble along as we were, this was in 2017 and 2018 when we were having these conversations, that come 2025, 27, we were going to taper off and perhaps even start declining. And how could we take advantage of leapfrogging and building to our strengths? And this is how the economic strategy tables, initially the 6 tables that were set up around advanced manufacturing, digitalization, clean tech, alternative technologies, agriculture, and my table, which was health and biosciences. And then came the pandemic and COVID hit us. And so there was a need to address recovery and some more immediate things. And 3 other economic strategy tables were put into place, and those were around tourism, hospitality and culture, resources of the future and transport, the airlines and airports and aerospace. And, we have these 9 tables, and the view and the objective of the council was to focus on the priority areas of the recommendations made by the economic strategy tables, which were made in 2018. And in full fairness, there was a start and a beginning to start addressing things before we were hit with the pandemic. But what were the important areas that we needed first for recovery and then for the reimagining piece, which was the longer term? So let me just, very quickly summarize that for you. And, what we were looking at in the recovery, which was to set a trajectory of inclusive growth for all Canadians, to reignite growth by doubling down on future-oriented investment plan. So this was about investing in our strengths, not picking winners and losers and leaving anybody behind, but really building to our strengths to build on what we had already done with a lens of diversity and talent on workforce innovation ecosystem building, and R&D funding robustly, access to capital to accelerate growth of Canadian firms, strategic infrastructure, especially around digital, not only physical, in innovation and digital infrastructure as well. Agile regulations, this came up in all of the sectors, that we needed to be more modernized regulations and have more agility in our regulations so they were more enabling. And strategic use of procurement. Some of the things that were spoken by other panels earlier, and certainly by Dave, around strategic procurement and the opportunity for government to be the demonstration site for sales. Scaling up of companies was another crucial area. And, then we looked at the reimagining part, where we said, well, Canada needs an industrial strategy. And we need, with 4 key pillars for a digital, sustainable, and innovative economy for all Canadians. That was the focus. So when I look at the budget 2021, I'm looking at it with that lens. Have we achieved that? Have we started that? To become a digital and data-driven economy, be the ESG world leader in resources, clean energy, and clean technology. Build innovative and high-value manufacturing where we can lead globally. So build to our strengths and leverage our agri-food advantage to feed the planet, because we have the opportunity to do that. And underpinning all of this were three things: the importance and critical need for establishing renewed private sector partnerships and investments anchored in sound and rigorous fiscal framework. PPPs, which were public-private, public-public, private partnerships to build robust infrastructure and scaffolds for working together. Because look, when we pivoted and responded to the pandemic, where were we successful? When we were all working together and collaborating. The second point was around deep sectoral insights and recommendations informed by data-driven analysis, and we did do that. I can tell you we had over 1,000 consultations at the ISC, and the report is a big one, 149 pages, because a lot of it is actually the attachments, the annex that provide the analysis. And finally, the foundational insights from industry consultations and broad stakeholder engagement, which was done widely, and we continue to do it. And what I've heard so far, and I think what you'll hear from this panel, is very strong alignment in what we all want to do, what needs to be done. I don't think there is argument in that. I think the argument is in, has this budget even touched on the focus of what we need to do, the scope, scale, and speed at which this needs to be done, so that we're not just inward looking, as Dave spoke about earlier this afternoon, looking at just the Canadian landscape, but looking at Canada within the global landscape, which is where our innovations and our companies, want to engage and play. That's where we need to be able to participate. So we are not about just what we can sell in Canada. The export business for us is critical. We have to grow. If we want to be successful, our GDP and jobs, we have to double down to get on that trajectory. So I'm going to kind of leave it there widely. I haven't drilled down into my sector of health biosciences, where there are many areas I can talk about, but I think I want to turn to my esteemed panelists who have a lot to say, and I'm going to ask each of them to talk for 4 or 5 minutes maximum around their particular sectors and constituencies, but with one question in mind as well, which is, what did you really like about this budget 2021? What did it address for you, or get started at least? And what was really missing that was a very big gap and gaping for you? So with that, I'm going to start with Angela first. Angela, if you would get us started.
Sure, absolutely. And thanks for having me. And hello, panel members. Great to be here. So I am going to start with what I liked about the budget, Karima, although I will get to the inward and narcissistic part, or the gaps, as David referred to it earlier. That was, I think, my favorite quote of his commentary. So we all know that the pandemic has proven a couple of things around the world, and that is that the connectivity and digitalization, both in government and business, can either make or break companies and economies. So in Canada, and I'm just going to show a quick slide here, we have clearly some work to do, and we heard that. Sorry, can you guys see the slide?
Yes.
Good. Okay. So we have a lot of work to do, and one of the things that I particularly liked was Michael Sabia's comment. He was referred to a lot today as well, in terms of digitalization having to become a national priority. And, we've even taken it from our perspective as the Technology Association of Canada one step further, where we really, truly believe, and this is kind of that boldness you're talking about, Karima, that digitalization has to become an absolute fundamental national strategy on par with the defense and security of our nation. And if that doesn't make sense, think about the underlying cybersecurity challenges that are going on globally. It's right up there with being a utility. And we really need to get to that place in terms of the tech sector and adopting and accelerating technology in every single sector. The second slide that I want to share, and I hope that all of you can see this as well, because I can't necessarily, oh, sorry, hang on, I'll just do this here, see if that helps from my end, is, I thought I had a downward trending slide until I saw David's presentation today, and I've come away, honestly, terrified. He talked about research and development driving the knowledge sector and the knowledge sector driving innovation. Look at the data of where Canada has gone in the last 10 years. In terms of e-government, that's the green line you see there. We used to sit, that means how digitalized were we as a government around the world. Third position in 2010, now we're down to 28th position in 2020. The World Economic Forum, in terms of our ICT competitiveness, how competitive are we from a technological aspect or tech adoption aspect, from 11th to 35th now in the World Economic Forum. And then Bloomberg Innovation, how much innovation does our nation have? We've gone from 11th to 22nd. We now sit between Italy and Slovenia. So that doesn't tell us, we looked a lot at the R&D and the GDP earlier. This is the impact of that on technology and how Canada sits from a tech perspective around the world. And this terrifies me. We have a huge amount of work to do. It is bar none the most economic, highest jobs, biggest growth for jobs, high paying jobs, underpinning every sector. So acceleration of adoption is really, really critical. In terms of what I liked about the budget, the government has taken a serious position on accelerating technology adoption. That's different than investing in our innovation or our tech sector and our scale up, so I'll get to that later. But the areas that I did like and that we're bullish about in terms of the budget, accelerating broadband. They've added $1 billion to the already $6 billion across the nation. That enables thousands of Canadians, thousands of regions and small, medium enterprises and new sectors to start getting on board and transitioning. So that's a good move. The Pan-Canadian AI strategy, in terms of innovation, we certainly are a global thinker when it comes to AI and research and development. We are the lowest, or one of the lowest countries from an IP perspective in a space that we lead. So not a ton of money there, but at least it's in black and white in the budget. We're investing in things like Canadian Digital Service, which is how our government connects with our citizens and our businesses. Almost $100 billion over 4 years there to make our government more digital. Maybe that'll help that green line of e-government that I showed you earlier, but really important space for us as well. And as well, the back-end infrastructure, so the data structure, the network modernization, another $1 million there. Two sweet spots that I do want to share with you that I think are fundamentally mission critical. The Canada Digital Adoption Program, $4 billion going there. So if you think about this, that money is going to enable not tech small medium enterprises, but all the other small medium enterprises out there that are struggling to transition and transform their companies, manufacturing, transportation, tourism. We saw in the retail sector a big uplift with online and e-commerce and digital payment, but this money will enable that other part of the 98% of our small medium enterprises and 50% of our gross domestic product to start taking advantage of the ability to go digital. That money will help them buy technology. It will provide them with advisory and mentoring services to get on board with technology. There's going to be some nebulous 28,000 young Canadians trained by some Canadian corp to work with these companies. We're actually volunteering for that, and some tax incentives. So thumbs up for that part for the government, because that is helping move our retail Main Street companies to become more digital. The other sweet spot is the investment in skills, more funding going in there, focus on clean tech and health. There are many other areas that we do need that skills training. The piece about this, though, that was a gap is we need skills in the next 12 to 18 months. We have a gap of mature Canadians moving into the tech sector, not just young Canadians or up and coming young Canadians. That's going to be a problem. I think we're going to have a grinding to a halt situation in the next 24 months if Canada doesn't get a grip. So quick summary, and then I'll hand back to you, Karima. The budget has taken steps to improve that green line, our e-government. They're taking steps to accelerate technology adoption in non-tech sectors. Missing, I'll get to that in the gaps in our next question, but there is a lot missing. So we have a lot of work to do still to get Canada back on track and turn these downward lines, but at least we got some very black and white. So back to you, Karima.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you. That's a great summary. On your skills and talent piece, I completely agree with you. And I think the other challenge is it's really nice that government has recognized that we need to help these young graduates, get into industry and getting, having a better academia industry kind of government link in how this is going to flow seamlessly. And how we're going to do that, because there's only sort of one organization that's been mentioned, which is MyTax, to kind of move this. I like you have my concerns whether that's going to be doable in the kind of time and speed that we need. Also, I think around immigration and other policies to kind of enable us also to bring back Canadians into Canada to come and work here if the jobs are here to work for. Right, yeah. So there's that whole other piece. So thank you for that. Next, Namir Anani. Namir, please, over to you.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Excellent. It's certainly my pleasure to be here and to unpack the 700 pages and also the 270 programs as it relates to the digital economy. I think it's fair just to start by who we are as an organization so that you have an idea where some of the remarks are coming from. So we're an independent national center of expertise for the digital economy with the aim of advancing Canada's digital advantage in a global context. We're anchored very much in a lot of research, forward-looking research. We've done a lot of work in the last year in research on economic resiliency in the face of adversity, or even policy contribution to the Davos discussions that took place recently. And we also provide policy advice, but also anchored as well in capacity building programs, both helping Canadians reskill and upskill, but as well helping companies adopt technologies and be the best they can in a global context. And we reached to several thousand across the country in both industry and academia, here, the US and Europe as well. So I think it's fair to say, just from a context point of view, that this has, the COVID-19 environment has had a devastating effect on the lives and livelihoods of Canadians. And many industry sectors verticals felt the full brunt of this environment, while others found some reprieve at being digital by default or adopting technologies quite rapidly to move either to survive or to thrive in this environment. And frankly, overnight, we've seen ourselves move into a contact-free economy, from the e-commerce, digital banking, e-learning, telehealth, and the list goes on in that landscape. And obviously, we've seen the colossal impact on the job market of around a million that was reduced recently to around 300,000 as the economy is starting to pick up. So in general, and let me contextualize then the parts that we see are very favorable in this budget. In general, we see that this budget strikes a good balance, the right balance between inclusive growth, but also job creation and focus on climate action. And I look at the aspect from three components. If you look at where are the areas that we see that this budget hit it well. First of all, as we all sort of expanded on that, is the skills agenda. I think the focus on the youth and the inclusiveness to create a shared digital future for Canadians is commendable. The aspects on whether the programming, whether it's the youth employment skill strategy or to help unemployed youth get into the marketplace, or the work integrated learning with help to bridge between post-secondary education and industry is very important. And I look at it from this perspective. This is the innovation, this is the creative capital for us in the future, for tomorrow's economy, the youth. That we have to ensure that they are present and are willing, ready to participate in today's and tomorrow's economy. I think leaving them behind can create what we call labor market scarring. And I would add to that there is a risk, given what's happening south of the border with all the several $1 trillion of investments and support mechanisms into recreating their economy, and obviously the opening a little bit of the immigration policy, is that we may see, if we don't act on the youth agenda, may see some kind of a trickle effect and hollowing effect, if not some brain drain into that. So this is important, and the focus on leveraging all human capital, whether women, Indigenous, people with disabilities, is clearly the way forward, because we have to, in a creative economy, leverage all the creative capital that we have as a country. The second is clearly the digital adoption. We were lagging behind other countries, and I think the focus on helping companies adopt technologies while leveraging the youth agenda is quite notable and it's quite commendable going forward. The focus also on the R&D is important, and helping companies understand their potential in terms of IP, intellectual property, and build that capacity is also critical in a knowledge economy as we expand. And we know that a digital-led economy will have a lot of innovation factor, and IP is going to play a critical component in that. And last but not least is the green economy. I think this has become, when I mentioned of the COVID environment that was upon us, came on the backdrop of many factors as well. Environmental trends, global trends in terms of global trading trends, but also labor market shifts. But the environmental aspect is going to be, not only for now, but for the future, is going to be critical, not only from a social and environmental sense, but also it's an economic imperative for us as an economy. The reason for that is that if you look across the globe in terms of the broad research that is out there, and if you look at Energy Post, for instance, they came out with a research recently saying that the global green economy is approximately $7.8 trillion. If you look at our economy, GDP, and back in 2019, we were $1.7 trillion. So it's almost 4.5 times of that, which is the green global economy. We need to position ourselves there and have a first mover advantage, because the actions and policies and decisions we make today will shape the environment of the future. What are the things that could have been improved? And there are many aspects that we can cover that may extend beyond this discussion, and maybe some of the questions in the future, in subsequent questions. But I think one aspect that comes to me that needs to be reflected on, well, I think we're all clear that there should be investment in R&D, and that we're trailing behind other OECD countries. There is another factor in this equation that we have to look at, is how do we turn this innovation into commercialization, newer markets, and then drive economic rent for it, because that's going to be the growth agenda for us in the future. And there's certainly a lot of policies on that. Look, UK, back in 2013, they adopted what they call the patent box. Basically, they said, if you come up and create intellectual property, but here's the trick, turn it into commercialized products and services, you benefit from very low taxation, corporate taxation. And that attracted many companies. And we have to look at such policies as much as others to attract not only the the innovators from within Canada, but maybe from abroad as well. I think in a knowledge economy, we have to leverage all the creative capital that we can get our hands on. Foreign direct investment, I think we have to look into to create the best ecosystems in Canada going forward. We have to attract quality foreign direct investment into Canada to create basically the ecosystems for the startups to be able to, so if I'm working on the battery system as part of this budget and I want to market this to the electric vehicle manufacturers, it's easier if I have a larger multinational in Canada or a larger market in that space developing to sell them and market this product to them, that they can reach then international markets without me having to go to expand on that. And last but not least, we have to increase trade. It's important, apart from the US, that we do 75% of our trade with. The CETA agreement is an important, this is a 450 million people and about $15 trillion economy. We need to act fast to start to establish ourselves in that environment. Let me stop here and look forward to any discussions going forward.
Thank you, Namir. That was excellent. I'm now going to ask Tabitha Bull to give us the perspective from the Indigenous Aboriginal businesses and the impact there and what was missing. Tabitha?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Ani, Buju, Tabitha, Indigenous Cost, Nipissing, Indigenous Bas. So good afternoon. I have just introduced myself in my own language and to say that I am from Nipissing First Nation and our totem is the eagle. I also want to recognize that I am meeting today on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas, the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and many First Nation Inuit and Métis people who I am honored to be one. Again, thank you. And I quite enjoyed the initial talk earlier today. I wrote down lots of little great nuggets from that. So thanks for that invitation also. We definitely initially, as Indigenous business perspective, were quite impressed with a number of items that were in the budget. A few key areas definitely were extension of the wage subsidy and the rent subsidy, as we know a number of our members have definitely used those programs. Additionally, there was funding as well, specifically for Indigenous businesses, which will likely go through loans and grants through what are called Aboriginal financial institutions, which we have definitely seen through this more recent COVID period and some of our recent surveys that there is a need for funding and grant programs to Indigenous businesses outside of the regular financial institutions. So only about 33% of Indigenous businesses in Canada have a relationship with one of the traditional larger financial institutions. So this funding that can go through Aboriginal financial institutions is much needed. There's also some funding for what is called the Indigenous Community Business Fund, which is specifically for Indigenous businesses that are on reserve or micro businesses that cannot access the community or the business emergency account. Again, because they don't have a relationship with a financial institution, or potentially they don't have a CRA number, because a number of the programs, as everyone will be aware, were tax exemptive, and if you have Indigenous employees and you're on First Nation land, then you don't pay taxes. So how can you benefit from a tax rebate program? So very pleased to see that. One thing that upon further reflection, we would have liked to see definitely more, and this was something that we had requested, isn't a national entrepreneurship strategy for Indigenous entrepreneurs. Currently, there are pockets of money and pockets of programming available, but there's nothing across all of government. And if you look at the budget as well, everything to do with Indigenous peoples is within Chapter 8. So if you look at how are we moving forward on Canadian business, or the chapter on Let's Make Canada Equal, it refers you to Chapter 8. And as an Indigenous person, at times that feels like we're being put into one chapter. we're not something that all of government is considering, and all of government is looking at their programs to ensure that there is an ability for Indigenous businesses and Indigenous peoples to be part of those programs. So I see lots of opportunities within the budget, with other programming, infrastructure funding, with other business opportunities, with a lot of the research, and some of that was optimistic as well. But we really want to be sure that within all of those programs, there is consideration of whether Indigenous people are applicable to be able to apply, but also how is it meeting the needs of Indigenous businesses and communities. There was $18 billion in supporting Indigenous people in the budget, which is actually the most that has ever been there, which is incredible. But I think we also need to ask the question of, because it's the most, does that mean that that's enough? And it's not. So there was $6 billion for infrastructure. We know that the gap of infrastructure within communities is 30 billion. So we have a ways to go there. And also, if we look at the percentage specifically on economic development and growing the economy in Indigenous business and Indigenous community, it's a very small percentage of the 18 billion. And we really want to be able to continue to tell the story that supporting Indigenous business supports Indigenous community. It builds transgenerational wealth, and it also has a ripple effect into the community that starts to close the socioeconomic gap. So that's definitely something that we'll be continuing to push forward and to be looking at and asking for, all of those pieces that the previous panelists have spoken about the importance of youth, the importance of us ensuring upskilling, the importance of broadband infrastructure. Those are all areas that we think will help to close the economic gap, but we need to have a focus on how we're supporting that Indigenous business within the community, who we know employs Indigenous people, and we know supports the community through their social responsibility platforms as well. So thank you very much for having me, Miigwech.
Thank you, Tabitha. And of course, the whole, broadband and the discussion around digitization in general impacts the Indigenous communities even more with the remoteness, and is even more applicable. And I'm sure we heard a lot about how it was felt, whether it was in education or in the delivery of health or what have you, even through this pandemic. So thank you. Dr. Karen Churchill next. Karen, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. This is a very, very fantastic group of speakers. And let me echo Karima in saying, using her words that I will also remember, that I violently agree with David Waters' talk this morning or earlier today. He and also my predecessor, Bill Gruel, who spoke for Protein Industries Canada, actually spoke a lot to the agriculture and ag business sector. And I have to just reiterate some of their words on how important this sector is to Canada. It is the second largest contributor to our GDP in Canada. And it's also so important in a country like ours that is resource rich and population poor, that we really have to think about it as an export strategy. And in terms of our overall exports, it is our 5th largest category. So it is really key to growth. And David really emphasized how important growth is going to be to supporting this budget and the balance between social and economic responsibilities. So I really also totally believed that we have to focus on the long term. And we did so much work on those industry strategy tables that should be our blueprint. In terms of recovery, which this budget focused a lot on, we know we need to invest in Canada's strengths to invest the weaknesses. And agriculture certainly is one of those strengths. And we saw that through the pandemic. It was fairly resilient and really did well in terms of economics. However, it also became forefront in the consumer's mind. Now, all of a sudden, food security is top of mind, and we saw the importance of supporting the supply chains because we had some empty shelves here and there throughout. The other important part is that future part. So reimagining where we're going next and building the digital, sustainable, and innovative economy for all Canadians had 4 pillars. And that 4th pillar is leveraging our agri-food advantage to feed the planet. So one of the good, so starting with the good things in this budget is there was a lot of horizontal technology platforms that are definitely going to benefit agriculture. So digitization, the 400 million that went to Genome Canada, some of those include agriculture products or agriculture projects. IRAP, the additional funding to IRAP will help support SMEs in this area. Innovation as a whole, supporting innovation, obviously a rising tide floats all boats, including the ag sector. The 60 million that went to superclusters, it wasn't determined exactly if that will be equally divided, but the protein innovation supercluster, of course, is one that speaks directly to agribusiness. What wasn't so great in the budget is we've stressed, in 3 different speakers have stressed how important agriculture is going to be, how outlined in the Barton report. This is a pillar to economic growth. And yet it wasn't articulated very clearly or separately in many places in the budget. There are a few good things like helping farmers adopt sustainable technologies, biofuels. So in the clean tech area, biofuels will definitely be an agriculture play. But there are so many others, and I think that agri-food has some unique challenges. And because of that, it does need that separate articulation, that vertical industry sector support. And let me give you an example. Again, we've seen quite a few examples where Canada lags behind in innovation, in converting that innovation to commercialization. And another very clear example is in our attraction of capital. I've just said Canada is an agriculture powerhouse. But when you look at venture capital investment in Canada, there was $4.4 billion in investment capital in Canada. 55% of that went to IT, 26% of that went to life sciences, and agriculture was so small it wasn't even listed in the chart. You take it also regionally, 90% of that venture capital goes to Ontario, Quebec, and BC. There was literally, I think, 1 venture capital project in Saskatchewan, 8 in Alberta, the rest in Ontario. It's that there's a flyover zone in our highest agriculture production areas. Compare that to the United States. In agri-food, they had $8.8 billion in venture capital. So I still think there was a lot of positives in this budget, especially in terms of recovery, but we need to start thinking about reimagining, rebuilding, what comes next. And I think maybe that was the goal, is to lay down the foundation in some of these programs and think about the next budget focusing on the future. And I certainly hope that is where we're trending. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen. And you're absolutely right. You know, the leveraging of the agri-food platform, which is so critical and has such opportunity, frankly, for feeding the world. And food security is obviously another big topic of discussion. And similarly, you know, we saw that, you know, over 11% of our economy is health, and we haven't, that wasn't mentioned, you know, as specifically either. So, you know, there are things that were definitely missing from the budget, but they were also, I would say, a lot of things are sort of hidden in the many programs and the many initiatives, the 270 initiatives. So we have to really sift through all of that. But thank you for that. That's some very important points. Carl Blackburn, Carl from Quebec will next, please. Over to you.
Thank you, Karima. First of all, I'm really nervous, Karima, because you have to know something. My name is Blackburn. This is the only thing I have in English. Then I will try to be clear for the participant at this afternoon. Then the Employers Council of Quebec, CPQ, is a confederation of nearly 100 associations and numerous corporate members like companies, institutions, and other employers. We represent the interests of more than 70,000 Quebec employers of all sizes and in all regions from the private and para-public sector. When the budget was presented, we especially welcomed the investment in infrastructure, in the development of a green technology, and the incentive for digital shift of businesses. In our view, these were good ingredients to fuel economic recovery. We say that innovation was a big winner in this budget, since the amount supporting investments are both substantial and diversified. More than $11 billion will help small and medium-sized businesses enter the digital age and take advantage of new technological opportunities, as well as support research and innovation and sustain the digital economy. Of course, we welcome the measures for the aerospace sector, which totaled $2 billion, a breath of fresh air for companies in this highly strategic sector for Quebec. But we particularly noted the $18 billion dedicated to the development of the green economy. We must recognize that the pandemic has changed many ways of doing things. It has not only transformed the world of work, but despite all its terrible effect, it has also forced people to question themselves. One of them is the way to consider the opportunities related to the environment. We can see that governments here and elsewhere are working hard to implement initiatives and measures to take advantage of the global recovery of activities to establish the foundation of a greener and more sustainable economy. We have welcomed the $8 billion dedicated to the decarbonization projects. We also highlighted the support for companies that develop zero-emission technologies, which will benefit from a 50% reduction in their tax rate. The proposed shift to the green economy provides a significant boost to the business. However, we found some gaps. Of course, first one challenge is in the implementation of the different measures, as was mentioned earlier by Mr. Waters. Then, where are the measures dedicated to employers for the training of their employees, including for digitalization and ICT, and even the green economy? All the measures to support workers will have to include a counterpart in terms of training or skill upgrading. For the CPQ, human capital is the foundation of any recovery. Without a workforce in sufficient quantity and with sufficient skill, there can be no economic recovery, no technology integration, and no green shift. To achieve productivity gains, tech integration must be coupled with investment in training. In fact, tech integration and the change it involves can something be subject to some resistance, which must be properly addressed. Also, there is no way around it. The question of financing all the increased social spending and the consequence burden of public finances. And that will take a good focus on measures to promote economic growth. Return to you, Karima.
Okay, thank you so much, Carl. Excellent. So let's try and answer some of the questions that we have and that some that we have from the audience as well. Angela, let me come to you first and ask you, what were some of the significant gaps in budget 2021 with respect to Canada's fastest growing tech sector? And if you could just speak to that, please.
Well, the biggest gap was there was very little investment in the tech sector. There was investment, like I said earlier, in the acceleration of technology adoption. And the area that we're most concerned about for Canada is what I call the middle child. So we have our accelerators and our super clusters and lots of funding you hear going into those areas. Then we have this middle ground of revenue generating, hardworking companies that are into everything: agri-tech, clean tech, minority-led companies, AI, VR, you name it. And they're revenue generating and they sell products. But they get completely lost in the shuffle in Canadian budgets, in Canadian discussion and focus. It's all about the accelerators and that front end of startups. This is the scale-up company and not the scale-outs. They're not the unicorns. Our lack of unicorns in Canada really demonstrate the fact that we haven't had that significant growth in our tech sector, because we'd have a lot more Shopify's. We'd have a lot more. I used to work for BlackBerry. I used to work for Nortel Networks. They used to have 30% of the Toronto Stock Exchange and market cap around the world. We don't have much of that 20 years later. So that's an indicator of the health of our middle ground tech sector. So why is this a problem? A couple of reasons. Obviously, as the SME space for Canada, again, this is our growth engine, our jobs, our growth in all of your sectors as well from a underlying technology perspective as we start developing in all of these other sectors. And the issues that our SMEs face are the same as many others. Very, very difficult to do business in our own country. Canada doesn't like buying from Canadian companies. I used to run a health tech company in predictive analytics, and I sold in the States, much easier than selling in Canada. The other thing that's a big challenge in the tech sector for growth of our small, medium enterprises is who can afford to compete and hire data analysts and data scientists. When you sit in Kitchener-Waterloo, where a great number of our beautiful SMEs begin, and you're sitting beside the Googles, the members of ours, and the big companies who can pay the big dollars. So Canada has a challenge as well for all of our sectors in terms of competing with the talent market that can go work for technology in every area. So part of what we believe is that the government needs to commit to buying technology from Canadian small, medium enterprises. And that's not hard to do. And that's kind of my second gap. And that's around, Karima, you touched on this, and so did David Waters, the strategic use of procurement. Government already spends $6.9 billion in the federal government alone on technology. They've just added another billion. Why not earmark some of that money, even if it was only $250 million? There are dozens, if not hundreds, of programs right now that could be built by small, medium enterprises. You heard me talk earlier about the e-payroll, and the digital services. These are citizen-facing, business-facing apps, online programs that need to be built. We have dozens of tech companies that can do that. I do want to throw a shout out, though, to Shared Services Canada, who's partnered with us to focus specifically on small, medium enterprises. I mentioned to Tabitha as well, there's a scale-up program that they're looking at launching with our organization for minority-led tech businesses. And the beauty of that is that small companies who generally cannot do business or get deals from big government are now going to have programs built and tailored just for minority-led business and small enterprises. So love that. I did have to mention that because that's a beautiful thing. And then one last gap, and I heard David talk about this. We talk about it all the time, is where is the plan? Canada doesn't have a technology roadmap. Our federal government, unlike the defense sector, where you can look at 3 years ahead, 5 years ahead, we need to replace the current jet with the F-35. I'm a little biased, but we need the same kind of plan for technology. What's our national cybersecurity strategy? So that part, I think, is a big challenge.
Questions we have to move, but you're absolutely right. And
okay,
one of, to your point, one of the big requests was an industrial plan, a roadmap
yes,
around these high potential sectors. Where do we want to be in 10 years? and what are we going to do to get there, and you know,
Absolutely.
how are we going to get there? So scale, scope, focus on these things. Thank you. I've got a question for Karen actually here, Karen. And it says, you know, more than 60 countries have national bioeconomy strategies. It goes a little bit to what Angela has just been saying as well. What more could Canada be doing to be part of what McKinsey says will be a $2 trillion a year industrial bioeconomy business by 2030? Will we make ag-based bioproducts here and export, or are we just gonna end up importing other countries' products? Why not create a bioprocurement program similar to the US Department of Agriculture, Karen?
Oh, I'm an optimist. I think that we absolutely are going to not be exporting our raw material going forward. And we've taken steps, and you know, another shout out to Protein Industries Canada. We've taken steps to stop being just an exporter of primary production. And, you know, the question mentions forestry, and that's what our 6th largest export. And anybody building a deck right now knows it well. I think that we do need to look to other countries and take a look at their strategies. And some of that was laid out, or a lot of that's laid out in those strategy tables too, because we have to look in-house at our tax competitiveness, regulatory reform, export support programs. And those are things that are all laid out in strategies, and we're taking steps there. I think the challenge to us in agribusiness is to show some leadership and some ingenuity and take advantage of what we have here and move forward ourselves. You know, we can be industry led too. We don't have to rely on the government.
Yeah, yeah. Namir, a question for you. Do you see this budget responding to our socioeconomic aspirations as a nation in the long term? You're muted. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting question. So definitely when we look at this budget from our point of view, I mean, it's really meeting the here and now. It's almost, you know, we've gone from a rescue to now a recovery, and it's trying to get us, it's almost like a ramp to the highway for the next year or two. The question is going to be, and I think we're all on the same wavelength, is that what are Canada's aspirations in the long term? What would 2030 and 2035 look like? It's an aspect that we have to reflect on. So I'll give you an example. If, for instance, urbanization of smart cities is the hub and the attraction for much of the economic growth and job creation, what type of connectivities are we looking at? What sort of smart infrastructure? What sort of IoTs? What sort of electric vehicles and connected systems? What support in terms of domestic supply chains that we need to develop for that economy going forward? And these obviously attract investments of the future. And I talked about, you know, one aspect that we need to strengthen as part of this budget is attracting foreign direct investment, because they create bigger ecosystems in Canada while managing a lot the checks and balances in terms of the IP protection in Canada. But we have to look at the long term, decide what would telehealth look and how the health system look in Canada. What would the agro-food industry look, and how would agrotech play a critical component in the advancement of these concepts? What would trade look like? How do we advance innovation? Is innovation only R&D? How do we make it into commercialized market growth? How do we increase trade with other nations, and which nations do we need to increase trade with? And then size the market, size the whole potential. Decide in terms of, if these are our aspirations in terms of green development, whether it's carbon capture, whether it's the battery or attracting electric vehicles, and the smart cities, the connected vehicles, the broadband infrastructure that helps all Canadians deal better with this increasingly and a trend of contact-free economy. We have to size, going to 2030, what would our GDP look like? And then from that definition of GDP, determine as well, have a better forecast of what job creation happened. And then we can have better analysis and decision making in terms of what do we need to do from the skill supply, from our schooling and post-secondary education systems, but also how do we help transition the workforce? Since our economy will change in the next 10 years and there will face some dramatic structural transformation, the biggest challenge we're going to face in the next number of years is how do we reskill that workforce? We're actually doing a small part of that in Alberta. We're working with the Calgary Economic Development to transition some of the oil and gas workers to in-demand sectors, growth sectors of the economy. And we're seeing incredible success in that. We have to reflect on all of this. So the answer is, we don't see this budget as a catch-all, as a strategic objectives for the next number of years. We have to collectively, as organizations, NGOs, industries, guided by maybe and supported by the government, to start putting together a bigger plan, a Canada 2030, a Canada 2035, like other countries, and develop that vision for us to create that environment. A strategic plan. And just to conclude on that, we're doing our part. I mean, we as an organization, we're having some discussions in mid-October. We're inviting several key speakers to heighten the discourse in that space, because at some point we have to start that dialogue. We're not waiting for an industry or a government to make that. Government has done its part. Let's move the agenda ourselves. I think we've given a good card. Let's play with it and move that agenda fast, because we have a lot to lose.
So you see this budget 2021 really just as a catalyst to get started, and then really together,
absolutely,
industry and government, to have a industrial strategy, longer term strategy to move forward.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
It's
now,
the first.
you the point of talent, Namir, and I want to bring that up with Carl, because Carl, you talked about human capital being a real challenge and issue in Quebec for you in terms of both quantity and quality of employees that are not sufficient. Could you talk about that a little bit more?
It's a very good question, Karima. First of all, it's a big issue right now. The situation was already very worrisome before the pandemic, and it's worse now. At the end of 2020, there were 150,000 vacant positions in Quebec. This number is greater than today than before the pandemic. Not to mention that the unemployment rate is hovering around 6%, which is very low. We did a survey at the beginning of April with our members. 94% of the companies surveyed indicated that they had a problem with the lack of workforce, both skilled and unskilled jobs. Half of them are currently refusing contract because of a lack of workforce. Worse, 42% are delaying investment. Delaying investment means that we are not improving our equipment or productivity. This will amplify the effect of the labor shortage. The solution relies on immigration. It is not the only solution, but it is the most popular for employers. Unfortunately, we have to deal with political decisions that slow down the entry of foreign workers in Quebec. Automation, digitization are investments that could compensate, and it is since the federal budget encourages innovation. But in Quebec, without workers, these strategic investments are delayed. That's a shame.
Okay, that's a really important. Now, talent and skills has come up a lot, and upskilling, and that was a big part of, I think, a lot of the work that we have done in many of these, whether it's the economic strategy tables or the ISC or wherever. Again, it's another one of those things that it's a call to action of how we get around that. And I think to Navir's point, we've got to not just leave everything to government. We've got to find some solutions, with business. And I think it's with business and government and academia, frankly, working together. That's the way that we're going to solve this, because opportunities like industrial degrees like Germany does, where right from day one, you can go into a university and you're working in a company and you're also studying, and all those kinds of programs. We need to really look at more aggressive programs beyond just the co-ops that we have. Tabitha, there's a question for you from the audience. Is there anything in the budget that would assist Aboriginal communities to switch from diesel fuel for heat and electricity to sustainable biomass boilers? The government has said it wants to get some 290 communities off diesel by 2030. Can the 6 billion for infrastructure be used for this? Over to you, Tabitha.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. So the 6 billion appears to be divided into 4.3 billion for what are shovel-ready projects. So it would definitely have to be a biomass project that was in that space. And then 1.7 billion is to cover ongoing maintenance of infrastructure within communities. However, there was 36 million over 3 years specifically to support Indigenous clean energy and to support Indigenous business and communities to be part of that clean energy solution within their community. And then also through the Net Zero Accelerator, through the Strategic Innovation Fund, our hope is that there will be some money there as well to support for Indigenous communities, potentially not specific. And I think it's key, I think it's Jeff that asked this question, that we not specify as to what technology a community would put in to replace diesel, but that we leave that up to the community to decide. So definitely looking for there to be, some funds from that Net Zero Accelerator Fund. The recent SIF amount that was spoken about today with the 83 contracts, none of those contracts were awarded to Indigenous business or community, and this is where we really want to ensure that all programs are accessible, equally accessible for all.
Okay, excellent, great. Just checking them, but we had another question here. Karen, no, we've already. So this I think is open to anybody. The question is around the good and word, expenditure that we have in government. And the question around shred credits, which is kind of interesting because, people love the shred program and in fact want the program to be expanded, but we are being asked here whether or not should we get rid of the shred or at least significantly reduce its applicability or its generosity because it's impacting the taxpayers by about 3 billion a year. Does anyone want to take that question? Shred, I can start by saying that shred has been one of the biggest incentives, certainly in the innovation industries and in R&D, in the life sciences and in biotech. That's been a huge attraction to doing the R&D here and creating the intellectual property here. And in fact, people would like to see it expanded more so that we can retain that here instead of intellectual property and our young companies moving south of the border or anywhere else, and Canada just being an off-balance sheet pipeline of innovation for other countries to have economic development. This is one of the few incentive programs, but I'll let the panelists speak as well. Anybody, any thoughts?
The one thing I would say, Karima, is that shred isn't necessarily tied to IP. I've had the advantage of using shred in the past with 2 companies that I led. That would be possibly something that would make a lot of sense in terms of the value back to the Canadian taxpayer, but also incenting the IP creation from shred. So yeah, the program is, it has some successes, it has some challenges, and it doesn't necessarily create, I think, what it needs to for Canadian companies. We could tighten it up, certainly, no question.
it's a good point. I mean, one of the things around the expansion that companies have said to us is that, look, when we start becoming successful and growing and we get a certain size, then shred is cut off for us. And then
That's right.
we go to other jurisdictions where, and these tech companies and biotech companies, the mobility is huge, where we have other incentives. So as long as head office operations are here, research is being done here, IP is generated here, and the high-paying jobs are here, why wouldn't we continue to expand shred?
Yeah, good point.
And it goes, Karima, to the point that I raised, if I may, earlier in terms of looking at the innovation, not for the sake of innovation, but ultimately the commercialization and creating markets as well. So we have to look at a rethink of all the policies necessary to create that environment in Canada. So helping companies in their growth potential, because if you create an environment where you can capitalize on your IP, but obviously if you're commercializing that IP, then ultimately you're benefiting from a very favorable tax relief. And maybe this has to be a surgical look into which sectors, verticals that we want to incent this environment to, because these are the ones that have the highest economic growth potential, but also job creation that we need to do. But we need to reflect on such policies in the future and maybe take a leaf from other countries. In fact, Quebec is implementing this patent box, as probably Carl would know, recently. And it's commendable that they're doing that. And I guarantee you, they will be attracting. I mean, why is London, for instance, generate 24% of the GDP of the UK? Because they were very good since 2013 to develop that policy, attract a lot of the fintech companies into that, not only from locally, from domestically, but from internationally.
Thank you. Look, there's still so many questions, and I really thank you all. I mean, we could talk about this for a long time, as you know, but unfortunately, we're sort of coming to the end of our time, and I'm so sorry because we could really talk for so much longer, and there's so many more things to speak about. But clearly, this is about creating an enabling environment where we can grow innovation, grow the impact of that innovation through the economic development and through high-paying jobs and through GDP and all of those good things. Because I want to sort of leave us with this sort of one thought that a few years ago I heard from the head of R&D for Intel, who was based in California, now lives in Israel and is heading a big incubator there, who said something like, tech without social justice and ethics can be an evil thing. But similarly, social justice and social programs that countries want to have for their people without technology and innovation is simply poverty. And it's a really important thought if you think about it, because I think what all of us in many of the discussions today, including ours, is we clearly want all of these social justice programs. We want to have programs that government can fund that are enabling. We are Canada. We want our safety nets for all Canadians. We want, success and growth and prosperity for all Canadians. But if we want that, we have to grow the pie, the economic pie. And so I think that I'm going to sort of go with, Namir's sort of optimistic point that this budget is just the catalyst, just the start. And by the way, there have to be many more budgets in years to come. But that we should all rally around that industry and business, work with government and with academia, and really come up, and I think to have that industrial strategy moving forward, where it's not about leaving anybody behind, but it's about building on our strengths, leveraging those, and trying to leapfrog our economy. Because as we've seen from the numbers this morning from Dave, we are slipping, and that's just not good enough. So with that, I really want to thank all of you so much, Angela, Karen, Tabitha, Carl, and Namir, very much for joining me today on this panel. And I want to just thank the audience for listening to us, and hopefully it was interesting and engaging, and also encourage you to check our website and the social media of CSPC, and make sure that you respond to the feedback poll. It's very important. And with that, the only other thing I'll say is that don't forget tomorrow we have academia and the next generation and non-governmental organization panels that we should participate in. With that, I'll hand over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karima. This is the end of today's symposium. I appreciate all the comments from all panelists. That was a fascinating discussions by this panel. But I also want to take the opportunity to thank all the speakers of this symposium, the first session today, the first day of the symposium, all the speakers. It was great contribution, and I think it was well liked by all the participants. Look forward to the discussions, to continuation of this discussion, and look forward to invite to have the panelists participating at our conference and contributing to further discussions.